Hey everyone, Sleepy Reader 666 here. It kind of, there's certain comic book artists that are part of my dreamscape. And a big one going back to when I was a kid is Gil Kane. Uh, and I believe he was an artist who was around since the early days of comic books, but maybe a lesser well known artist until the Silver Age. Um, and I remember reading interviews with him in the 80s or 90s, um, where he explained how he became more serious about doing comic books, and he took some time off and he really thought about how he was doing it and put together anatomy in a new way and really upped his game and really spent a lot of time thinking about the page and the layout and became famous for all the thumbnails and working out of ideas he did. He was kind of a more heady artist, I suppose, for the time. Although when you look at his work, it's very physical. It's very action. So he would be famous enough just for his early Silver Age work. Let me get this going. Where he was a famous Green Lantern artist and Adam Strange and a bunch of other things. And lots of classic covers by him and classic interiors too. Uh, it's all kind of fun. I always thought of him as the up the nose artist, although here, and maybe I'll try to show you some examples of why that was part of my thinking about him as a kid. But here we can see, even in this earlier work by him in the 50s and 60s, he was an artist who was always kind of bending and twisting the bodies in interesting, very physical ways. There's a little bit of some up the nose action there. Here you can see a whole bunch of his Green Lantern covers where everything is very twisty. There's the Atom, and everything's very twisty. He seemed to like certain poses do reoccur, like this kind of person falling backwards like that. But so it seems like he was kind of this classic Silver Age DC kind of artist, and then he switched over to Marvel, and something happened to his art. It got beefier, I think, and fuller, and the action increased. He's done some famous runs on early Spider-Man, usually with John Romita inking, and this was always one of my favorite issues. So I have been lazy, and rather than photographing comic books that I have, and I don't have many of them anymore anyway, I just got all these images online. So yeah, he was. What am I trying to say here? Anyway, he switched over to Marvel. We see him at Marvel all of a sudden in a lot of places. Captain Marvel, Spider-Man. Of course, he's famous for a lot of covers at Marvel. He became their go-to cover artist, I think, in the later half of the 70s and the early 80s. And of course, here's an iconic cover, but really not one of Gil Kane's most amazing covers. He's done some really amazing covers. And I mentioned before he was kind of well known for his thumbnails, and maybe this is standard practice, but at the time when I was reading about him, it was supposedly a special thing about him, about all the thumbnails he did and how he really figured everything out ahead of time. And so he would draw on pieces of typing paper with a felt marker and just draw out everything. So these are obviously some pages from some THOR issues he did. So the point of me doing this video is how Gil Kane's in my brain and kind of part of my dreamscape. And this particular cover, when I was a boy, it was featured in all the comic books I bought at the time in an ad for this comic book. I don't believe I've ever read Valley of the Worm. or owned a copy of the comic book. So another one I should go out and get. But this image, because it was in a bunch of comic books that I owned in the ads, the house ads, just burned its way into my dreams. Like somehow this is where I was dreaming myself as a boy, as a barbarian in some kind of, nightmarish, dreamish kind of world. So I've just always really loved this cover. I don't even know what else to say about it, but it must be a combination of the pose of the barbarian fighter and all these dead bodies of knights and this unusual dragon-like worm. Here's another similar cover. So to me, a lot of comic books are quite dreamlike, obviously, and deal with unreal stuff, with great visuals and stuff. But for me in particular, after Jack Kirby, Gil Kane's imagery really got into my dreams, and seems somehow something particularly not of this world about them. And another thing that I always noticed about Gil Kane and somehow made it more dreamlike to me, which is this kind of power glow, for lack of a better word, that's around a lot of his characters. It's maybe a little bit like Jack Kirby's Kirby Crackle, but he uses it in a somewhat different way, and it seems to be generally used to show that these characters are glowing with power or something. And it has a kind of plasma look almost, or I don't know, something like that, with kind of these dots floating around and bubbles or something. So a lot of his figures had that, and somehow that just added to the dreamlike quality. This glowing plasma around the characters just made them seem more like figures out of dreams to me. Oh, there's one without it, but a nice fantasy shot, so I just threw that in. He seemed adept at sword and sorcery and science fiction and superheroes in equal measure. So, and here's another character that in my early childhood was particularly striking to me when drawn initially by Gil Kane. And he did the interiors on Warlock, the first run of Warlock before Jim Starlin revived Warlock later on. Lots of the power glow around Warlock, and there was just kind of, Warlock's main enemies were the Beastmen, and it was on Counter Earth, and he was kind of this Christ-like figure, and the Beastmen were like the devil that came to this paradise. And when drawn by Gil Kane, it just seemed like out of some ultra intense dream to me. And lots of the power glow around old Warlock. Originally, Warlock was called Him in some issues of Fantastic Four. And then we have the High Evolutionary getting involved with Warlock. Here you got the up-the-nose shots there in spades. I haven't been looking for the up-the-nose shots, but that's how I originally identified Gil Kane. I would start noticing this artist who always did these up-the-nose shots. But of course he has a lot of other distinctive features of the way he kind of does his kind of twisting bodies with the legs with the kind of turned out calves, and the arms are often kind of twisty. And he just draws muscles in a certain way that seems like only Gil Kane draws the muscles quite this way. And power glow. I mean, another weird dreamlike thing about Warlock is he would make a cocoon and then come out of the cocoon. And of course that comes from the original Jack Kirby version, but it just seems even more bizarre when drawn by Gil Kane. An up-the-nose floating head. So, fighting one of the Beastmen at Cape Canaveral. So I don't know. It just for me, these are just images out of my dreams. I did get as a kid most of the Gil Kane Warlock run, and of course don't have any of that now. I now have the Marvel Essentials of Warlock. just the kind of twisty. It just all seems out of Dreams to me, and then almost as dreamlike, and interesting that I equate him both with Warlock and Captain Marvel, and then I equate Jim Starlin with both Captain Marvel and Warlock. But almost as dreamlike seem to be the adventures of Captain Marvel, especially when drawn by Gil Kane. I assume this is a unused pencils of a cover. He probably redrew it, or someone else drew the final result. But anyway, somehow the adventures of Captain Marvel seemed particularly dreamlike, again, especially when drawn by Gil Kane. I'm not seeing the power glow right here, but there's some more power glow. Anybody can have a power glow who's a hero in Gil Kane. I don't know if villains ever have a power glow. There's Rick Jones with the power glow. I believe this is the end of the Scree. Oh, there it says the end of the the Skrull Kree War. They're calling it here. Later, it was called the Kree Skrull War. And so Gil Kane, maybe they found his covers sold particularly well, or maybe the editors just particularly loved Gil Kane, or he was really fast and great at covers. Because his covers were everywhere. And I think maybe if he'd done more long runs of comic books, he'd even be better remembered today. Covers are great, but I think in the end, if you do some long, meaty stories, you become even more memorable. So you're the star of the moment if you're doing covers, but you're the star in the history of comics if you're doing the interiors. All his 70s Marvel stuff, or I shouldn't say all, but a lot of it just strikes me as dreamlike, and obviously often the subject matter is dreamlike. But he just seemed to, for me, to add this extra dreamlike thing. You can see like the twistiness of the legs there, and this is really not a prime cover, but I picked it out anyway for that dreamlikeness. Any of these characters just seem heightened, and the wildness of the whole thing just seemed to be emphasized even more by Gil Kane. And yeah, so even, what you might think a pretty straightforward superhero comic book like The Defenders, when Gil Kane's drawing the covers, you just seem off in dreamland again. Or Daredevil. I wonder if Gil Kane ever did interiors of Daredevil, because with his sort of athletic twistiness, he probably would have made a great Daredevil artist. Anyway, he did a lot of covers. Beast and Iron Man somehow seem more dreamlike. And maybe, I hate to be like Freudian or whatever, but there was something extra sexual about Gil Kane over some of the other artists like John Romita or Jack Kirby. Everyone, male or female, just seems kind of curvy and slinky. That's so cool. Stop, don't enter that hill. It's alive and it's hungry. Sprag the living mountain. That's no doubt a reprint comic book with new covers by Gil Kane. Yeah, even when he does Thor, it's just a very different Thor than other people's Thor. I guess those wolves have the power glow, unless that's Thor's power glow, but it looks like the wolves. So maybe the bad guys sometimes get it. It almost seems like his covers are almost tortured. Everything is more painful and intense in a way. And even his covers to these Western comics, which were probably, again, reprints, I'm guessing, they really make being a cowboy seem dreamlike to me. There's another super twisty Daredevil. He really liked to emphasize the rib cage, I'm now thinking. along with the up the nose, loving the up the nose shot and the twisty fingers kind of shots. I guess he did quite a bit of the John Carter of Mars adaptations. Okay, and then another thing is, I've read that he hated other inkers inking over his work, although obviously most of the time it was. And here's him inking himself. And he liked to ink with felt markers, which is very unusual. And to me, it maybe gives his work inked by himself a lighter, like a more floaty feeling, like just less solid feeling. So I almost like other inkers on him, at least some other inkers. I assume this inker is Tom Palmer, who was the inker of this comic book of the interiors also. Love those twisty fingers. And there's even Odin looking kind of twisty and almost sensual in this picture, and that alien. Anyway, it's just all... Another thing he did for a while, I think with the popularity of Star Wars, was a Sunday comic strip called Starhawks, which I'd like to get a collection of that sometime. But he had his own way with science fiction, but it's definitely a very cool look at science fiction. He also tried to publish some of his own creator-owned, which was not a term back then, but he was one of the few artists who tried to do his own thing that he owned. Black Mark, and I want to say My Name is Savage or something like that, and a few other things. So Black Mark was published in mass market paperbacks by a regular paperback publisher, by Bantam Books. Then he also did a lot of Conan. He did a few interiors of Conan, but a ton of Conan covers. If I had to guess, this one was inked by, I can't remember his first name now, something Reese, Ray Reese. I just feel like that's his inking. Inkers are almost never credited. Here's Conan inked by Ernie Chua. Gil Kane inked by Ernie Chua. I can tell his inks anywhere. Who was the regular inker of the interior that was usually done by John Buscema. Now, why apparently Gil Kane covers would sell better than John Buscema covers, I find that kind of shocking. But they put a ton of Gil Kane covers on Conan. An interesting thing, as much as I love Conan, and as much as Conan for me generally is very a dreamlike character, Gil Kane's Conan covers don't seem to capture that dreamlike quality as well as his other covers. Although this one is kind of cool, and this seems to me to kind of hark back to his simpler Silver Age DC covers, and it's also inked by him with that lighter touch with the felt markers. But a really nice composition. But it's almost like he wasn't as into Conan as he was into other things or something. Conan just seems a little blander, less personality. Although here's the exception. I found this up there. I don't think it's a cover. It must have just been a sketch he did for someone or a pinup in one of the black and white magazines. That's quite a cool picture. Here's a sketch of one of his covers. So I guess I'm imagining, if I ever became a collector of original art, that there's probably lots of Gil Kane sketches and layouts out there since he did so many of them. And there's a very finished cover. Again, this must be inked by Ernie Chua, who gave it a lot of, completely changed the Gil Kane lightness and gave it a lot of heavy solidity. But you still get all the twistiness and such. This one's a bit more dreamlike, I guess, and there's a bit more detail in Conan's face. But overall, for some reason, even though I'm showing lots of Conan covers, it's kind of my least favorite Gil Kane work. This one, though, I always thought was a very cool composition. And maybe I was wrong about Ray Reese because this one clearly signed. The inker is Brunner, um, another great artist. But it looks similar to the inking that I thought was by Reese. Some pinups. There's a sketch for that King Conan one that I was admiring. I find these sketches very exciting. There's so much movement in them, and you get this sense of him deeply into just the shape and movement of bodies and loving to move bodies in all different kind of directions and angles. So at some point, I'm not sure exactly when, in the early 80s, it seems he returned to DC with his new, looser style, often inking himself. There's the power glow did not go away. I guess Conan never got the power glow. I'm not even sure if this really is Gil Kane in this picture, but the internet said it was Gil Kane. I remember him doing a special run. It was when miniseries were still kind of a new, exciting thing. Gil Kane doing the Atom as a barbarian, and that was a lot of fun. And you can see his name was listed first before the writer. He was a big star, and I bet DC was very happy to get him back. And this is just really cool art, but kind of funny at the same time, riding on frogs and stuff. There's the Atom with the glow and the floating heads. I guess Gil Kane probably did a lot of floating heads. So yeah, Gil Kane really gave me a lot of pleasure as a kid, and it's pleasurable looking at his work now. It doesn't seem like I'm quite sure his art is very influential, but it doesn't seem like it's a mode of drawing that you see in comic books now. Maybe because it's just so about the lines and the movement. And about action. So, thanks for hanging out with me again, and I will be back again tomorrow, I hope, with another in my vlog countdown. Till then, bye-bye.